Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go into a brand new chapter, which is Chapter 7, Gaseous Exchange and its Control. In this chapter, we have 3 main subtopics, and each of these subtopics will come in its own video. Now for this video, we're going to go into Chapter 7.1, where we will learn about gaseous exchange and control in mammals. As usual, before we go into the lesson, let's have a look at the learning outcomes for this subtopic. I hope that by the end of this lesson, you would be able to describe the structure of hemoglobin and its characteristic as respiratory pigments, describe 3 ways of carbon dioxide transport from respiring tissue to the lungs, analyze the oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin, and then compare it to the oxygen dissociation curve of myoglobin. And last but not least, analyze the effect of the changes in partial pressure of carbon dioxide towards the oxygen dissociation curve, which is what we call the Bohr effect. Now, those all sound like big words, and I promise you we're going to go through each of these segment by segment, and I hope that you're able to digest them one at a time. So if you're ready, let's get started and think about what do we mean by gaseous exchange? Gaseous exchange, pertukaran gas, is the movement of respiratory gases between the organisms and its environment. Secara ringkasnya, ini adalah macam mana oksigen dengan karbon dioksida daripada udara dapat masuk ke dalam badan kita, masuk ke dalam setiap sel dalam badan kita. In mammals like us, gaseous exchange will occur at the alveoli of the lung. So, dalam paru-paru kita, ada alveoli yang banyak, di sanalah kita akan adakan pertukaran gas. So that brings us to studying the structure of the lungs. So you know what your lungs are. Kamu tahu sudah paru-paru itu apa? It is the site for gaseous exchange. In terms of the structure, your lungs consist of bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. Your lungs come in a pair and they are a spongy organ. Kalau siapa yang pernah potong ayam, bila kamu sampai pada paru-paru tu, kamu dapat pegang paru-paru ayam tersebut, kamu rasa dia macam sponge, lembut. Okay? And they will also occupy your thoracic cavity. What do we mean by thoracic cavity? If this is your head and that is your thorax and that is your abdomen, inside your thorax, there is an empty space. Okay? Dalam dada kita, dalam thorax, ada ruang kosong. Dalam ruang kosong itulah kita simpan organ-organ dalaman kita seperti paru-paru, tulang rusuk, kita punya sebahagian daripada kita punya hati, kita punya jantung, dan sebagainya. So a lot of your internal organs will go into your thoracic cavity, including your lungs. Your lungs are enclosed in a protective bony case. Okay, it's a soft organ. So what protects it is your rib cage. Tulang rusuk kita menutupi dan melindungi kita punya paru-paru. So this is what your lungs look like. It's a diagram of lungs. And as you can see here, the shape of the left lung and the right lung is not the same. The right lung will be divided into 3 lobes. You see here the superior, middle, and inferior lobe. Maksud superior adalah di atas. Maksud inferior adalah di bawah. So ini bahagian di atas, bahagian di tengah, bahagian di bawah. Whereas the left lung is divided into 2 lobes only. So it's only the superior and the inferior lobe. Another thing you might notice here is that the left lung has a different shape and it is smaller in size. I'm sure you could guess why your left lung would be smaller than your right lung. The answer for that is your heart will sit on the left side of your chest. So it will sit around here under the superior lobe. Mana yang kamu nampak ada tempat kosong itu, sana lah di tempat jantung kamu akan duduk. The reason why the left lung is smaller than the right lung is because it makes space for the heart. Okay? So this is another diagram showing the structure of the human lung. Your respiratory system, we can say it starts from your nose. Okay, kalau kita cakap pasal sistem respirasi badan kita, dia mula daripada hidung, sambung kepada oral cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea. Okay, trachea kita dilindungi oleh cartilage. Turun daripada trachea adalah bronchi. Kiri satu satu bronkus kanan, satu bronkus. Bila ada dua bronkus, kita namakan bronchi. Dan setiap bronkus akan bercabang. Okay, dia akan pecah kepada banyak-banyak cabang. Setiap cabang itu digelar sebagai bronchioles. Okay, bronchi branch off into bronchioles. And all of this is protected by the ribs or rib cage. Over here, you can also see this muscle over here, which is your diaphragm. And pleural cavity maksudnya adalah ruang kosong di sekeliling kamu punya paru-paru. Pleura. Okay, so this is, if you take off the outer layer or if you only look at the alveoli, this is what your lungs actually are. Kita punya paru-paru, apa yang kita nampak, apa yang kita dapat sentuh itu adalah actually kita punya alveolus. Banyak-banyak alveolus yang banyak kecil-kecil berbulat-bulat macam ini. And that will bring us to talking about the air tract of alveoli. Okay, daripada hidung, udara boleh masuk terus daripada hidung kita turun kepada trachea, kepada bronchus, kepada bronchiole, dan masuk ke dalam setiap alveolus. Okay, so this is the air tract, or where the air can pass on the way to the alveoli. Alright, so let's talk about the adaptation of alveolus as a respiratory structure. Mari kita belajar pasal alveolus yang membenarkan kita untuk bernafas. Okay, so when we talk about adaptations of alveolus, we're talking about all the characteristics that make it so good at helping us in respiration, at helping us breathe. And the first adaptation of alveolus is that they are an air sac-like spherical structure and are very small. Air sac, maksudnya dia adalah kantung udara. Ini adalah organ yang seakan-akan kantung udara. That's what air sac-like means. Spherical, they are in the shape of a sphere, and they're very small. Because of their shape and size, they are able to provide a very large surface area. The second adaptation of alveolus is they consist of a single layer cell and are covered with a dense network of blood capillaries. So, kamu nampak seperti dalam diagram ini. Okay, dia punya alveolus nipis saja, satu sel saja ketebalan dia. Dan dikelilingi oleh banyak blood capillary. Jadi udara, oksigen ke karbon dioksida senang untuk limpas alveolus masuk ke dalam darah ataupun keluar dari darah masuk ke dalam alveolus. Because of the shape, the large surface area, we can do a lot of this gaseous exchange. And number two, because of the thin layer, single layer cell, and because the blood vessels are right here, it's easy for the gases to diffuse in and out of the alveolus. So it is allowing for efficient gaseous exchange. Third adaptation of alveolus as a respiratory structure is they are surrounded by fine elastic fibers. Kalau kamu rasa kamu tidak nampak mana itu fine elastic fibers, I advise you to zoom in on the diagrams. Kamu nampak di sini yang ini, elastic fibers ini, dia melitupi semua alveolus. Why is the fine elastic fiber a main point? It's because these elastic fibers bagaikan getah yang menjaga ketegangan ataupun jaga bentuk alveolus. It allows them to expand and recoil easily during breathing. Okay, so this allows the alveolus to expand and shrink, recoil easily during breathing. Dia mudah untuk mengembang dan mengecut sebab ada itu fine elastic fibers. Fourth adaptation of alveolus as a respiratory structure is that the inner walls of the alveolus are always moist by the fluid that contains natural surfactant. Apa maksud ayat di sini? Maksud ayat di sini adalah alveolus kita sentiasa basah. Sebab badan kita akan menghasilkan lendir, a fluid, that will keep the alveolus moist. Lendir yang dihasilkan oleh badan kita itu akan memastikan alveolus itu sentiasa lembab. The fluid, cecair yang saya cakap tu, lendir tu, dia akan mengandungi natural surfactant. So natural surfactant means it's gonna that's a thing that will make sure that the cells remain moist. Dia tidak akan kering. Why we want the alveoli to stay moist, it's to prevent the walls of alveoli from sticking together. Kita tidak mau bila dia kering nanti dia melekat sama satu sama lain. Dia tidak mudah untuk expand dan recoil. Also, when your surface is moist, it speeds up the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air and the alveoli. So, ini akan mempercepatkan proses pertukaran gas. Okay, so those four are the main points when we talk about adaptation of alveolus as a respiratory structure. Next part, we will talk about the next person that receives the gases. You already learned about red blood cells before, but we'll just go over them again in this lesson just to refresh and also to identify which characteristics are adaptations to make it transport oxygen even more efficiently. Okay, so the first adaptation of erythrocytes to transport oxygen is its biconcave cell shape. The biconcave shape allows it to increase the surface area of the cell for more efficient gaseous exchange. Red blood cells also have no nucleus. So when there is no nucleus inside the cell, that means there is more space for more hemoglobin proteins. And they generate ATP by anaerobic respiration. They don't do any aerobic respiration that would use oxygen so that the transported oxygen is not consumed. So macam kila kalau dia buat anaerobic sahaja, dia tidak akan terguna oksigen yang dia sedang angkut. Okay, jadi tiada pembaziran lah dari aspek itu. Where do red blood cells get their energy from? It is from glycolysis in anaerobic respiration. So erythrocytes get their ATP from glycolysis, which is the process of breakdown of glucose. So their main and only energy source is through glucose. Okay, and then we talk about the protein that makes red blood cells red, which is hemoglobin. Let's look at the structure of hemoglobin. We have a diagram of hemoglobin over here on the right. Hemoglobin is a conjugated protein. Conjugated protein maksudnya dia ada protein chain dan dia ada juga prosthetic group. Okay, so dalam case hemoglobin, dia punya protein adalah globin. Globin is the name of the protein itself, okay, the protein amino acid chain, and iron is the prosthetic group. Hemoglobin exists in a quaternary structure protein, and it consists of 4 polypeptide chains. When we have 4 polypeptide chains, we call that a tetramer. Tetra meaning 4. So in the 4 polypeptide chains, 2 of them are alpha chains and 2 of them are beta chains. So di sini adalah kita punya alpha chain, di atas yang coklat ini adalah beta chain. And each polypeptide chain will contain one heme group. So kalau kamu tengok dalam diagram ini, yang warna pink, merah di tengah-tengah setiap polypeptide chain, itu adalah heme group. And each hemoglobin molecule will contain 4 heme groups. 1, 2, 3, 4. Once again, this is the structure of hemoglobin. Over here, we have the more simple diagram, and on the right we show the molecular structure. Okay, ini adalah dia punya skeleton. Okay, so kalau ini kita boleh nampak segala single bond, double bond, dan kita nampak juga itu iron ataupun ferrum yang ngam-ngam di tengah-tengah heme group. Okay, so this is the hemoglobin. This is only the structure of the heme group inside. So what makes the hemoglobin so useful in transporting oxygen is it has a high affinity for oxygen. Dia sangat suka melekat dengan oxygen. So it is able to bind with oxygen, forming oxyhemoglobin. you will have saturated blood with oxygen in the lungs because it has high affinity for oxygen. They can also easily release oxygen. When the partial pressure of oxygen is low, such as in the tissue that undergo respiration, dissociation of oxyhemoglobin will form oxygen and hemoglobin. Bila perlu, dia dapat melepaskan oksigen yang dia pegang. Thirdly, hemoglobin have cooperative binding. What is cooperative binding? We need to look at it in two scenarios. When you have high partial pressure of oxygen, which is high concentration of oxygen, the binding of the first oxygen to hemoglobin will alter the shape of hemoglobin to easily accept the other oxygen molecule. Masa konsentrasi oksigen itu tinggi, partial pressure oksigen pun akan meningkat. So in high partial pressure of oxygen, the first oxygen molecule masuk. Bila molekul oksigen yang pertama masuk ke dalam hemoglobin, dia akan menyebabkan hemoglobin itu lebih terbuka dan lebih senang terima molekul oksigen yang kedua, ketiga, dan keempat. The first oxygen binding alters the shape to easily accept the other oxygen molecules. And the opposite will happen when you have low partial pressure of oxygen. In the second scenario, which is low partial pressure of oxygen, low concentration of oxygen, dissociation of one molecule of oxygen from oxyhemoglobin alters the shape of hemoglobin and make it easily dissociate the other oxygen molecule. Bila ada low concentration of oxygen, low partial pressure of oxygen, bila satu molekul oksigen itu terkeluar daripada hemoglobin, dia akan menyebabkan hemoglobin itu lebih senang untuk lepaskan molekul oksigen yang lain. So we can look at this in this diagram. In this diagram, you will see, okay, this is without any oxygen binding to it. When the first oxygen molecule binds to hemoglobin, it alters the shape. Kamu tengok dia punya structure pun semakin besar. Dia punya ruang untuk oksigen masuk semakin besar. Dan oksigen molekul yang kedua, ketiga, dan keempat lebih mudah untuk masuk. When there is a low concentration of oxygen, low partial pressure of oxygen, the first oxygen molecule to go out will make it easier for the other oxygen molecules to go out as well. So this is cooperative binding of hemoglobin. Fourth characteristic of hemoglobin is the reaction of oxygen with hemoglobin is completely reversible. Memang dia reversible lah. Dia boleh pegang, dia boleh lepaskan. And this does not affect the shape of the hemoglobin. And then the hemoglobin will carry carbon dioxide in the form of carbaminohemoglobin from the tissue to the lung, where partial pressure of oxygen is low. Last but not least, the sixth characteristic of hemoglobin is that it acts as a buffer for hydrogen ions. Next, we will talk about gaseous exchange. So gaseous exchange, as you already know, it occurs between the blood and the lungs. It is when atmospheric oxygen transfers from the lungs to the bloodstream and then is transported throughout the body. The carbon dioxide at respiring tissue is transported to the lung through the bloodstream and then released to the atmosphere through the lung. And this is a diagram showing that, but this is something that you are quite familiar with already. What we're going to talk about, which it might be a little bit confusing now, is the partial pressure. So this gaseous exchange will occur depending on the partial pressure of each respiratory gases in the lungs and the blood. Okay? what is partial pressure? You already learned in physics and also in chemistry that gas can exert some pressure. Gas tu bila dia dalam bentuk gas, dia boleh ada tekanan, pressure. So when we talk about partial pressure, what we mean is this: the pressure of one type of gas that proportional to its concentration in the mixture of gases and not affected by other gases. So, contoh kalau kita cakap pasal oxygen, bila concentration oxygen tinggi, banyak molekul oxygen dalam ruang tu, tekanan yang molekul oxygen atau gas itu akan keluarkan, the pressure that it will exert to its environment is the partial pressure. And it depends on the concentration of that gas. The example that we have in this slide is carbon dioxide. So the higher the carbon dioxide concentration, the higher the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Bila banyak concentration dia, tinggi lah partial pressure dia, bergantung kepada gas. With that knowledge, now you already know what is partial pressure. I hope you'll be able to understand the following explanations. So let us talk about that transport of oxygen. So when we talk about transport of oxygen, we are talking from alveolus to tissue. Oxygen will be transported from alveoli of the lung to the respiring tissue through the blood. When the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is high, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood capillary is low, that is when oxygen from alveoli will diffuse into the blood capillary. And then oxygen will bind to hemoglobin of red blood cell, forming oxyhemoglobin. One molecule of hemoglobin can bind to 4 molecules of oxygen, which is why in this formula you see that it is written as Hb bracket O2 bracket 4. Then that oxyhemoglobin is transported to the respiring tissue throughout the body. So sekarang dia daripada alveoli, daripada paru-paru, dia pergi kepada setiap sel kita. Sel kita akan buat aerobic respiration. Dan dia akan kekurangan oksigen. So when it reaches the cell, it reaches the tissue yang buat respiration tu, dia akan kurang oksigen di sekeliling dia. So partial pressure of oxygen in the respiring tissue will be low. When partial pressure of oxygen in respiring tissue is low, oxyhemoglobin is dissociated into oxygen and hemoglobin. Dia akan pecah kepada hemoglobin dan oxygen. Oxygen will be diffused into the respiring tissue. That's it. That is transport of oxygen. Begitu simple saja. Start daripada alveolus, jadi oxyhemoglobin, sampai kepada tisu, jadi oxygen and hemoglobin. Pastikan bila kamu explain, kamu gunakan perkataan when partial pressure of oxygen is high, partial pressure of oxygen is low. Boleh tulis sebagai PO2. Okay. Next, we are going to talk about transport of carbon dioxide. When we talk about carbon dioxide, we're talking about carbon dioxide from aerobic respiration of respiring tissues. And this carbon dioxide will be transported via respiring tissue to the alveoli of the lung via the blood. There are 3 methods that our blood will use to transport carbon dioxide from respiring tissues to the alveoli. The first method is carbon dioxide will be dissolved and transported in the blood plasma. This is only some of the carbon dioxide, about 7%. And then more carbon dioxide will be transported in the form of carbaminohemoglobin. We'll talk more about carbaminohemoglobin later. Right now we're going on to the third method. The third method is lots more of that carbon dioxide will be transported in the blood plasma in the form of bicarbonate ion. So now let us have a look at each of these three methods. This is a diagram to summarize what I've said just now. Diagram ni cuma merumuskan 3 method tadi tu. Okay, so let's talk about the first method. The first method is 7% of carbon dioxide will be dissolved and transported in blood plasma. We will start with the respiring tissues. In the respiring tissue, you will have high partial pressure of carbon dioxide and low partial pressure of oxygen. The carbon dioxide diffuse and dissolve in the blood plasma and is transported to the lung. In the alveoli, where you will have high partial pressure of oxygen and low partial pressure of carbon dioxide diffuse into the alveoli to be expelled by exhalation. And this is a diagram to show that. Dia start dari respiring tissue, dia larut dalam plasma, dia sampai di paru-paru, di alveoli, dia daripada terlarut di plasma, dia diffuse, meresap, diffuse, I am bad. But basically it diffuses from the plasma into the alveoli. Very straightforward, very simple to explain. The second method, in the form of carbaminohemoglobin. Let's look at this step by step. First step, in respiring tissue, you will have high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, low partial pressure of oxygen. Carbon dioxide will combine with the amino group of hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin and transported to the lung. So, dia tidak akan melekat di tengah-tengah di itu hem group. Dia akan pergi kepada amino group of hemoglobin. So, dia melekat pada polypeptide chain. Itulah nama dia carbaminohemoglobin. And then, when it reaches the lung, in the alveoli, there will be high partial pressure of oxygen and low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Carbaminohemoglobin will dissociate to form hemoglobin and carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide diffuse into alveoli. This is a diagram to show that. So that is occurring at this second step. Okay, CO2 masuk, dia gabung dengan hemoglobin, jadi carbaminohemoglobin. Dia sampai di paru-paru, daripada carbaminohemoglobin, dia dissociate, dia terpecah, bercerai, menjadi kepada hemoglobin dan carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide akan pergi kepada alveolus, diffuse out. The third method of carbon dioxide in blood is a large amount of that carbon dioxide, about 70%, will be transported in the blood plasma in the form of bicarbonate ion. How does this happen? Let's take a look. In the respiring tissue, you will have high partial pressure of carbon dioxide and low partial pressure of oxygen. Carbon dioxide diffuse out of the tissue into the blood plasma. Carbon dioxide will diffuse into the erythrocyte from the blood plasma. So, daripada plasma, dia masuk ke dalam sel darah merah. In the erythrocyte, carbon dioxide binds with water, H2O, forming carbonic acid, H2CO3. This reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Enzim carbonic anhydrase akan bantu carbon dioxide untuk bergabung dengan air. Dia akan jadi H2CO3 ataupun carbonic acid. Apa terjadi? In respiring tissue, blah, 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 blah. This carbonic acid, H2CO3, will dissociate into hydrogen ion, H+, and bicarbonate ion, HCO3. So, dia akan berpecah, dia jadi acid. Daripada acid jadi ion. And then this hydrogen ion binds with hemoglobin forming hemoglobinic acid. Hydrogen ion binds with hemoglobin forming hemoglobinic acid. Hemoglobin will act as a buffer to prevent decrease in pH. Tujuan dia gabung dengan hemoglobin adalah untuk jaga pH darah. Okay, still in the respiring tissue, the bicarbonate ion will diffuse out of the erythrocyte and transported in the blood plasma to alveoli. Bila dia sudah jadi bicarbonate ion, dia keluar daripada sel darah merah, dia akan duduk dalam plasma. Lepas tu tunggu sampai dia orang sampai di paru-paru. This is to maintain the electrochemical balance so that chloride ion enters the erythrocyte for each bicarbonate ion that diffuse out. This is called a chloride shift. When it reaches the alveoli, there will be high partial pressure of oxygen, low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Bicarbonate ion will diffuse into erythrocyte from blood plasma. It will bind with hydrogen ion forming carbonic acid. Carbonic acid converts back into carbon dioxide and hydrogen dioxide. No, sorry. Carbonic acid will convert back into carbon dioxide and water. And then the carbon dioxide will then diffuse into blood plasma and into the alveolar space in the lungs. In other words, dia masuk sebagai CO2, dia gabung dengan air, dia jadi H2CO3, dia berpecah kepada bicarbonate ion iaitu HCO3 negative. Lepas tu bila sampai di alveolus, lepas tu dia akan keluar dari red blood cell. And then bila sampai di alveolus, dia akan masuk semula dalam red blood cell, dia gabung dengan hydrogen, dia jadi balik H2CO3. Daripada H2CO3, dia pecah lagi kepada CO2 dan air. CO2 diffuse out of red blood cell into plasma, into alveolus. Itu sajalah. So those are the three methods of transporting carbon dioxide in blood. Untuk soalan esei, biasa soalan esei akan minta kamu jelaskan 3 metode ini sekaligus. Okay, so it's not very long, but try to remember the points. Try to draw the diagrams yourself if it helps you to understand and remember. So let's look at this oxygen dissociation curve or ODC of hemoglobin. The purpose of having this oxygen dissociation curve, tujuan kita tengok ini raja, is to show the relationship between percentage of hemoglobin saturated with oxygen at different partial pressure of oxygen. Berapa banyak oksigen yang ada dalam hemoglobin pada tekanan partial pressure yang berbeza. So when you look at this diagram, this is the curve, this is the ODC of hemoglobin that I talked about. So on the y-axis, that is oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, how much oxygen is in the hemoglobin molecules. And on the x-axis is the partial pressure of oxygen. So that is reflecting what is the concentration of oxygen in the tissues next to the blood and what is the partial pressure of that oxygen. So if you look at this curve, you will see that it is a sigmoid shape. And you already know that hemoglobin has a high affinity towards oxygen. Bila boleh, dia akan pegang oxygen. So during exercise, which is this point right here, when you are exercising, your tissues are using up the oxygen supply that it has. So there will be less oxygen molecules in the tissue. When there is low concentration of oxygen, of course, you will have low partial pressure of oxygen. When you're exercising, partial pressure of oxygen in your tissues is 12 mmHg. At 12 mmHg, hemoglobin is about 18% saturated with oxygen. The percentage of blood saturation will reduce rapidly because oxyhemoglobin dissociate into oxygen and hemoglobin. Kalau kamu fikir secara logik, masa kita punya tisu sedang bersenam, kita buat aerobic respiration, tisu perlukan oksigen. Jadi hemoglobin akan lepaskan dia punya oksigen untuk tisu kita gunakan. So that is basically what these 3 points are saying. And this is shown by the steepest part of the curve. So ini adalah bahagian curve ini yang paling curam. When you're at rest, for example, right now, when you're just sitting or when you're standing, your tissues are at rest. The partial pressure of oxygen in your tissues right now is 40 mmHg. What will happen is the hemoglobin is about 70% saturated with oxygen. Nearly a third of its oxygen have been released by dissociation. So at this point, 30% of the oxygen in your blood is released into your tissue. So tissue kita gunakan lebih kurang 30%, yang tinggal dalam darah, oksigen yang tinggal dalam darah lebih kurang 70%. When you get to the lungs, in the lung, the partial pressure of oxygen will be at its maximum at 100 mmHg. At this point, the hemoglobin is associated with oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin is about 98% saturated with oxygen. Bila ada di paru-paru, banyak oksigen akan melekat dengan hemoglobin. Hemoglobin lebih kurang 98% saturated. The curve can be shifted to the left or to the right, depending on the circumstances. The more the curve is displaced to the right, the less readily the hemoglobin pick up oxygen and more easily it releases oxygen. So kalau kamu tengok gambar aja nih, kalau dari ODC yang normal ini kita boleh shift dia sebelah kanan. If you shift it more to the right, that means the hemoglobin lebih murah hati. Hemoglobin kamu akan lambat ambil oksigen dan murah hati untuk lepaskan oksigen. The more the curve is displaced to the left, the more readily the hemoglobin pick up oxygen and the less easily it releases oxygen. Bila dia pergi kepada sebelah kiri, hemoglobin semakin kedekut oksigen. Asal ada oksigen, dia akan ambil dan pegang. Dan lambat baru dia boleh lepaskan oksigen. And we will use that knowledge when we compare the ODC between hemoglobin and myoglobin. So first we'll talk about what is myoglobin. Maybe you heard of this word before. Myoglobin is the red pigment in mammalian muscle. So it is also a protein that you find in your muscle. It consists of a single polypeptide chain containing one heme group. And this myoglobin will combine with oxygen to form oxymyoglobin. The role of myoglobin is to store oxygen in muscles. It shows greater affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin. The oxygen dissociation curve or ODC of myoglobin is more to the left. Dia punya fungsi, sudahlah dia duduk dalam muscle, fungsi dia untuk pegang oksigen, dan dia akan lebih kedekut oksigen. ODC of myoglobin has a hyperbolic shape. As you can see here, it is hyperbolic. Dia sangat curam di sebelah kiri dia. Dan sangat ke kiri lah berbanding dengan curve untuk hemoglobin. Even at low partial pressure of oxygen, its percentage of saturation with oxygen is still high. Even when the surrounding tissue has little oxygen, it will still be kedekut and hold on to its oxygen molecule. It will only release its oxygen molecule when the partial pressure of oxygen in the muscle is very low. Bila itu muscle sampai sesak nafas sudah, kekurangan oksigen sudah betul-betul kekurangan oksigen, baru oxymyoglobin akan lepaskan dia punya oxygen molecule. This is to ensure that aerobic respiration will continue for as long as possible before anaerobic respiration will take over. So this is a comparison of that myoglobin and hemoglobin ODC. The ODC can be shifted. ODC for hemoglobin can be shifted according to the Bohr effect. Displacement of the Bohr effect can be explained as the displacement of ODC due to increase in partial pressure of carbon dioxide in active or respiring tissue. So tadi kita cakap pasal kalau kita tengok oksigen sekejap. Sekarang kita tengok di sel-sel, di tisu-tisu yang sedang melakukan aerobic respiration, dia lepaskan karbon dioksida kan? So bila ada karbon dioksida, macam mana dia akan mempengaruhi keberkesanan hemoglobin? When you have partial pressure of carbon dioxide, increasing partial pressure of carbon dioxide, that means banyak carbon dioxide dalam tisu kita, it will cause the ODC to shift to the right. This is important. Oh, salah eja importance. Sorry. The importance is to ensure more efficient oxygen delivery from oxyhemoglobin in the respiring tissue. So let's look at what happens, Bohr effect in respiring tissue. Okay, so we have a very handsome muscle man on the diagram. In the respiring tissue, there will be high rate of cellular respiration. So you will increase the concentration of carbon dioxide in those tissues. With high carbon dioxide concentration, you will have increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide will react with water, forming carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates become H plus and bicarbonate ion. There is increase in H plus, so you will have lower pH, or the blood will become more acidic. When you have low pH, it will decrease the affinity for hemoglobin for oxygen. Thus, oxyhemoglobin will dissociate to oxygen and hemoglobin. Bila kita punya sel banyak buat respiration, dia akan keluarkan CO2. CO2 akan menjadi acid. Acid means increase H plus. Increase in H plus means blood becomes more acidic. Lower pH. Lower pH will affect the bonds in the polypeptide chain. Ingat, ini adalah protein, dia ada dia punya bond-bond. So, bila pH berubah, dia punya keberkesanan pun berubah. So, it will have a decreased affinity for oxygen. So, that means it will be lebih murah hati. Hemoglobin akan menjadi murah hati. Dia akan lebih suka menderma oxygen. It will be easily dissociate. So this results in the ODC of the hemoglobin during exercise, during respiration, to shift to the right. Therefore, the hemoglobin will release oxygen more easily because of carbon dioxide. So this is that Bohr effect. You can see it in the shifted diagram. Pada asal dia adalah yang titik-titik. Lepas Bohr shift, dia jadi garisan yang lurus ini, yang gelap ini. So just a quick summary of what we've done in the video today. It is quite a long video, and I thank you for staying this long. We look at the structure of the lung. We look at the structure of the alveolus. We look at the structure of erythrocytes. And then we talk about the structure of hemoglobin. And then we gave the definition of gaseous exchange, and I also talk about what is partial pressure in this video, in this part of the video. And then we talk about the transport of oxygen. After we talk about the transport of oxygen, we talked about the transport of carbon dioxide, which is done in 3 methods. And then we talk about the ODC, or the oxygen dissociation curve. We talk about hemoglobin ODC, myoglobin ODC, and we also talk about Bohr effect, which is what happens when you have increasing carbon dioxide.